Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 801st New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the unique pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Aliza Nisenbaum and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. We're thrilled to welcome poet Stephanie Adams-Santos here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Born in Mexico City, Aliza Nisenbaum paints portraits that are the manifestation of exchanges with her subjects taking place over time. She engages with distinct social groups on various levels, sharing resources, skills, and ultimately social representation. Nisenbaum is currently finalizing a commission for a joint collaboration with the Queens Museum and Delta Airlines, with a mosaic to be installed at the new Terminal C at LaGuardia Airport in 2024. Among other notable solo shows, she exhibited at the Tate Liverpool in 2021, and she also recently participated in the Gwangju Biennale in South Korea. And our host today, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, is an artist and writer living and working in New York. We're also lucky to have her as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'll pass it over to Gaby.
Hi, everyone. And I just wanted to thank Chloe, the rest of the Rail folks, and all of y'all for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to get to be talking with Aliza today, an artist who I've admired for a long time. And so there's a lot at work in Aliza's work, and I think themselves are really engaging, colorful, and dense. And I think another part of Aliza's practice is that there's quite a lot of work that happens alongside the actual artworks themselves. And so as a way to introduce and sort of get the conversation started, I thought that we might just start out with asking you about sort of how this show at the the Queens Museum, Queens Linda y Querida, came to be. And maybe some of the history that has gone into this particular exhibition at this particular place, in particular, your time working with Immigrants Movement International in the early aughties, as we call them, and collaborating, which was an organization founded by Tania Bruguera in Queens, and your work there, as well as with La Jornada and the Queens Museum Cultural Food Pantry, kind of as relating to Queens and the location of the exhibition.
Thank you, Gaby. That's a great place to start. And thank you, Chloe and Fang and everyone for inviting us to this. I love the Brooklyn Rail, and it's great to be in conversation here. So I guess, yes, if we go way back, it's quite special for me to be showing at the Queens Museum, because it's such a contingent museum on its community, and it's really a small, I mean, it's big actually, but it's a museum that really is very tied to the community where it belongs, Corona and Flushing. And it was almost a decade ago in 2012 when I started being interested in a space that Tania Bruguera opened in Corona called Immigrant Movement International. And I was so moved by her idea, and she told me we really need English teachers in this space. So I was like, I'm not a English teacher by training, but I'll teach English translation through like feminist art history. It became as the class progressed, because it was mostly a group of women that joined my class, and they were really interested in knowing about female artists. So basically from the ground up, like informed by texts and images that they were interested in, I started this class. And it was, as I said, 2012. And as the class progressed, I started to get so interested in my students' stories, and it was like a very safe community that we formed, and we would go out to the Met, and sometimes this continues sometimes into my work. It was for some of the participants the first time they had been exposed to museums and to art in person. And jumping forward to now to the show that's up, one of my collaborators and sitters who I've painted, a group of a mother and daughter who I've painted since 2012, Marisa, the young woman, said that it was very important for her to be seen in this museum because this is the first place where the Queens is the first place where she experienced art. So that class happened in 2012, and again, here's Marisa with her father, Gustavo, and this is a painting. Basically, I painted Marisa since the age of 12 till like 22, now that she's in college at Cornell. And I've got to witness her growth, basically. So this was like becoming a teenager pretty much with her dad. And oftentimes I pair like different temporalities in the painting. So the background is Talavera from their native Puebla, and then the foreground is her and her father one day when I visited them in their home in Corona. So if we go a little bit, if we move a bit, we can see some of the installation on the left at the museum. There's some of the early paintings I made, these two small ones on the way left from 2012. And so the show incorporates a new pedagogical experiment that I did with La Jornada, as you said, Gaby. There's La Jornada is a food pantry that has been housed at the museum since the beginning of the pandemic. They've been feeding thousands of people. And I was very interested. My studio was located, first of all, I was brought into the museum because of this collaboration with Delta for the airport. And my studio was located right as this food pantry took place every Wednesday. So every Wednesday I'd see these long lines that would snake out into the park, and the volunteers that would, tirelessly every Wednesday participate in distributing the food, bringing it from centers of distribution. So this is into the museums. This is the Delta mural that's going to be translated into tiles. And so I got really interested in knowing the culture of the participants from La Jornada, these volunteers. And so I suggested with the Queens Museum that maybe I could teach them a class because they're housed in a museum. They're curious about what goes on, the shows that were being mounted at the museum. And so I taught a painting class from basically September of 2022 till March of this year to the volunteers from the food pantry. So their work is displayed along mine at this installation. So I guess we'll get into that a little bit further as we go with your thoughts, Gaby. But yeah, so they came kind of full circle. This class I taught in 2012, and again, teaching a class now at the Queens Museum itself.
This is an interesting, it sort of leads into ideas about pedagogy. And the fact that as you've been talking about it, pedagogy has played such an important role in both your work outside of the studio and your practice as an artist. And I think it's interesting because you include the idea of the school, both literally and formally, inside of the Queens Museum installation as it is. Sort of most literally in the part of the show that includes some paintings on easel, perhaps the representations of work by your students. And also that you set this up with floor tiles that like take me straight back to public school in New York, for sure, right? So a melding of these sort of like institutional locations. And I was wondering if you could talk, just while we're here, and especially I think as an introduction to get into the paintings themselves, If you could talk about the function of pedagogy in maybe like your life and your work, it feels too limiting to just talk about it in relationship to painting. But yeah, what the function has been of including teaching in your practice in a way that feels both active and reciprocal, and not just unidirectional in a way that we might think about a hierarchical educational structure.
That's a nice way to put it. Maybe we could go to the image of the installation with the school, with the students' work. That would be really great to see while we talk about this. So this is the students from La Jornada, the volunteers' work on the right, and then a painting I made from various different moments of that class itself. The slide before is the painting of the class itself. So I think pedagogy has like permeated so much of my life. I started studying social work when I was in undergrad in Mexico, and then I went into art, but I feel like it's gone back and forth since I was a kid, pretty much. And I remember probably some of you know Barbara Rossi, the Chicago imagist, who was my teacher in Chicago, but she always said that we should become, students should become almost detectives of their own intuition or their own interests. And I feel like that makes teaching so transformative to me. It's also interesting that this show is happening in Queens, because my first job was at LaGuardia Community College in Queens itself. And then I taught at various, who knows how many, I mean, almost 15 different institutions or so since my time in Chicago, ending up at Columbia and directing the graduate school there for a bit, the graduate program, and then finally giving up that job to kind of do work teaching that kind of is less tied to an institution and can be a little bit more pliable. But I'm very interested in Paulo Freire and Boal and people that talk about education as an empowerment tool. You know, I've experienced it so much, how when students become aware of their own voice and they know their desire to express themselves, obviously, but once they find the tools or the vocabulary, especially in something so pleasurable as painting, and kind of the tying in of the pleasure of the material aspect of painting with ideas leads to, I don't know, to like a sense of kind of being, I mean, it might be a big claim, but thinking about being an agent in your own life in some ways, you know, and so I think I'm really interested in teaching in that manner. And I don't know, what else did you ask, Gaby? Even the formal elements, like the floor here with tiles mimics obviously the floor in the painting. But we initially did this because during the run of the show, there'll be 3 or 4 different mini talleres, mini workshops where the students will lead classes for the general public itself. Even Tom Finkelpearl, that was the former director of the Queens Museum, and his interest in giving, like the different structures of how you give back to a community and make them become participants in teaching, much more, become agents of their own education and their own freedom, I guess. If you want to be super idealistic, I'm very interested in those actions. So this is, go ahead, Gaby.
No, go ahead.
I think that was it. But we started with so many basic, like kind of formal activities of color and stuff. And then I was actually really proud of the students' work. That portrait in particular here by Samir with the trees. I don't know. I'm really happy with the way the work turned out for the students.
The way that you talk about pedagogy and agency and sort of these moments that are educational and also kind of transformative in the moment seems to also have a relationship to how you've spoken about portraiture in other interviews. especially I think there's some moments, I think it's maybe one of the Tate interviews that you did, where the kind of vulnerability of painting someone and having them sort of looking on, being like, does this really look like me? And then being able to locate themselves. And the sort of fluidity with which you open your observational representational practice to the literal eyes and evaluations of your sitters. Is something that also kind of comes to mind when you bring up this idea of agency and the possibility that in making this painting, there could be another kind of agency which is shared in that kind of presence. And I'm wondering if that's something that you're thinking about, as we move from introducing the kind of like larger structural considerations that you're thinking about toward the like the immediacy of painting and what you're, like how you're handling materials and engaging in observation.
Yeah, I mean, I oftentimes, I think that when you're painting, I used to always paint from life, and there was something very interesting of the type of conversations that came up during that painting process. And now it's a hybrid between life and photographs and Zooms that was transformed basically through during the time of the pandemic, where I couldn't be face-to-face with my sitters. So therefore there was all kinds of different research and other ways of witnessing each other that wasn't always in the moment when I'm painting them. But I found that kind of just the basic process of sitting with somebody and witnessing, being in proximity to their body, and how their body gets tired. You have to kind of get them into, slowly lull them into being interested in sitting with you and into being comfortable. It's a very in the moment collaborative process, because if they're wiggling their leg too much or, distracted, you can't concentrate. So really in the moment, it's a very, direct kind of collaboration, and their energy is helping you. But likewise, even when it's through Zooms or photographs or drawings that I use now to make the paintings, there has to be some kind of chemistry in the first place between us, between the person letting me lending their vulnerability to be painted, and my trying to get some kind of sense of their personality or their gesture through painting and color, obviously. But in that, I feel like there's kind of an ethics that comes about from sitting with somebody. I think it was in maybe the video of the Brixton project that I did in the London Underground, where I was living in England and doing this public commission for the subway, for the metro there. And it was during the time of Brexit, and people would come. My studio was located in the back of this subway station, the hub of the Victoria line in Brixton, not Brexit. But so each one of the sitters would come and sit for me in the back of the station, and they would all tell me particularly about their experience, their points of view in relation to Brexit. And I feel like, that's sitting with each other. And also at immigrant movement, people would tell me their experiences of immigration and living in Queens and their journey from Mexico or Central America, oftentimes to the US. It's a very subtle type of communication and a very subtle kind of understanding that's quite unlike the way we talk to each other on social media or other ways that we depersonalize our interactions with the humanity of other people, basically, even if they might be different to us. And so I think that the immediacy of painting and color and looking at the kind of small facets of a person's skin is a way of materializing that kind of attention. And so I think it's kind of embedded in this process of how I work with different communities, and each community has very different types of needs and ways that I might approach them. And this one at Queens is probably my longest engagement with a group of people, because it has spawned, because I was in residence for almost 2 years at the museum, and because of this longer history, obviously.
Yeah, I know that we were talking a little bit before about and you just sort of mentioned your interest in the ethics of care. And I know that you're also really interested in how visibility and representation also has its own ethical structure that we might talk about as like more aesthetic or something like this, right? It's something that feels, although it's also obviously political as well, right? Where visibility and access inside of politics and social structures are obviously so closely connected. But I was wondering, yeah, if you might talk a little bit about how you see ideas about care and visibility coming together in your work, and how you make these considerations in relationship to the different communities that you're working with.
Mhm. This is another one of those very early ones. I think that, I mean, it's interesting how sometimes those categories get distinguished, you know, like aesthetics or ethics of care. But I was just reading or listening to Adrienne Murray Brown, and I feel like that my care really is in the aesthetics, you know, in the color and in the pleasure of the visual, you know, because I feel like representation is always such a big word, you know, whether people are represented correctly, or, you know, the politics of representation that we see all around right now. But I feel like really what gives art its special strength is how it hits you on an effective level, you know, and I feel like color is one of the ways that you might be overwhelmed with a feeling that you can't necessarily obviously place into dialogue or into ideology or into stereotypes of representation. And I feel like that's something I'm really interested in, working with individuals rather than tropes of representation, you know, and what else were you asking? I think that, yeah, oftentimes politics gets discussed in these macro levels of, you know, resources and large structural ideas, but there's a lot of transformation in subtle acts of care, whether it be like paying close attention to somebody and their extended family through the paintings made of various generations, or through the simple nuance of like witnessing somebody and having them enjoy the opening that we just had at the Queen's Museum, where people brought their extended families and saw themselves represented, and it was a very celebratory experience. So I think in that celebration and that pleasure, there's a lot of potential as well.
I was also thinking about how often in your work, you know, you're working with communities, like how often in your work, labor is a part of, you know, the communities that you're representing. Like you're painting people who you work with on some level, right? And you also have you know, it's like a part of the connection to community that you have sort of worked with in some other places, both in Brixton, as you were talking about, and in Liverpool, if I'm not mistaken, are like museum workers, transit workers, and that part of your work also seems significant in relationship to this question of like maybe a false differentiation between aesthetics and ethics, or care and representation. That like artwork is one kind of work or one kind of attention, and that there are in fact all of these other kinds of work that locate us in the place that we're looking at the art, which I think speaks to the site specificity of your projects as well, and the attentiveness that you bring toward both the institutions that you're working with and also to the communities that you're thinking about, where, you know, it turns out that the Queen's Museum has such a long and involved history with community engagement and public art and making itself available to Queens. And maybe this is, you know, something to think about as well in connection to like the other aesthetic and art historical references present in your work. But I think that, like, you know, the idea of utopianism and labor gets us really quickly into people like Diego Rivera and like certain kinds of like utopian populist aesthetics. I mean, I was also thinking about like 1930s WPA projects, and a certain tendency in art that feels like it's less present today. So it's really exciting to see you working in this vein that feels both really public and extremely aesthetic, where painting is able to occupy this position as painting and also as part of this larger kind of like set of concerns or questions around politics.
Yeah, yeah. The idea. Maybe I'll start with the idea of the group portrait in some ways and labor, because there is such a long history in painting of the group portrait, like the 19th century French depiction of group portraiture, you know, and how these painters that were depicting modern life would think about these different configurations, and not obviously in Mexico also with the muralists. It's interesting, like, yeah, that history is so fascinating because Vasconcelos, who was also the Minister of Education in Mexico, brought about this program in Mexico with Obregón right after the Mexican Revolution. That was the reason why Roosevelt started the WPA. So it was really inspired by a pedagogue in Mexico to start the WPA in the States. But these ideas, I'm super interested in those historic representations of groups of people and labor, you know, and how, whether people are estranged from their labor or how they belong as an individual within a larger community, and what each individual's role may be when they do form a part of a larger community. So, because we're always like both, I love Fred Moten, how he talks about rethinking our modes of assembly, how we assemble, and how we're, even in different communal assemblies of work, we're also individuals always, you know. So I started these paintings in 2012 when I was really going into portraiture, and they were always individuals. And I feel like when I make these larger group portraits, like if we look at the one of Delta, or any of the others, like they're like individuals. Sometimes, often they're kind of in their own thoughts or in their own private world, and they're also part of this group. But that's something I'm really interested in picturing, people like for themselves and also for the public, especially with the work with immigrant movement and that community. But there's so much to be said. I don't know where else to go there.
I was just thinking about how fitting it is. I mean, just sort of like to extend this part of the conversation, which it seems is like really significant and really moving in your work as well. But that like the idea of painting as a kind of like moment of pause. And I know that you're thinking about different temporalities in terms of how you're making the painting, but that like the painting becomes like an image. And that like this moment of pause happens in the middle of like in the airport, literally people coming and going, and also that you're so interested in communities of migrants as well, literal communities of transportation, right, of food distribution, that there's like a kind of interesting dynamic between the movement of labor, the movement of commodities, the movement of people, and like the function of painting as a place that we can kind of like sit still for a second and look at it. And that just feels really poignant in the midst of the airport commission as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it is. That is really a moment of where people are frantic, right? But it is like that. Airports and traveling are always kind of these liminal spaces, like painting, a kind of moment of pause, especially when you're finally on the plane. But yeah, often the compositions, usually there's a moment of pause, obviously, in looking at the skin and really getting into it. But the larger compositions, especially with the group portraits, are an extension of various moments in time, obviously, of witnessing these particular communities and various viewpoints, like overhead. If we look at the one of the food pantry itself, it's winding, you know, it's many different, there it is, many different moments that I, over the 2 years that I was there, every Wednesday kind of seeing the food pantry and how it would develop, and going to the second floor of the museum and looking down and then looking from underneath. And some of the people that took my class, obviously, they're the same individuals in this food pantry painting. And obviously there's always a confluence between, you know, figuration, abstraction, like I was thinking about the floor, and you can't see it very much here, but I wanted it to be like a kind of network or some kind of thing, not literal, but that would make the composition circular. And I remember looking down at my, you know, tablecloth, and I was like, okay, this has to be like a Mexican kind of, what are these called? Hay tablecloth. In some ways, the floor became that, you know, so the paintings, really the composition is an extension of those moments of various temporalities. And likewise with these two paintings on the left, where these are on the right, on the far left, sorry, is Andre, who would greet me every day at the museum. He was out at the front desk every day in his office. He's been working at the Queens Museum for over 30 years. So different paraphernalia from his office, you know, the US Open from '93 and various different music that he likes. And Gia on the right, who was the community leader that I would liaise with for working with the food pantry volunteers. And, you know, here's on the far right hand of the painting, like a blackboard with every week how many families would be fed by the food pantry. Like it would go in the hundreds every week, pretty much.
Thank you. I mean, I feel like there's also so much room here to even like, it seems like a good moment to ask about like other anecdotes, and if there's particular people's stories that feel that you would want to tell. Like it seems like your work also is so chatty in this way, like it carries all of these vernacular stories along with the kind of objects that you've surrounded folks with.
That's a great, yeah, it is very chatty, isn't it? That's a great way. I'm going to use that. Yes, I think it's so interesting when you get immersed in seeing how different communities function, you know, and different kind of informal networks that they function in, especially when there isn't structural support from the government. Sometimes how there might be like cooperachas, as they say in Spanish, like a informal banking system where people put in a little money each week, and then there's a pool whenever it's needed, people use it, you know. So I feel like that's interesting with the volunteers or with people at immigrant movement that I worked with. Each workforce obviously has its chattiness. What can I tell you? Okay, let me think. What if we go to the to the Delta piece, David Russell, who was the firefighter that I painted, he was one of the firefighters in charge of September 11th. And he came to my studio at the Queens Museum, and he brought tons of photos of you know, memorabilia from that time. And I walked him through the panorama, and we're going to the museum, and I are going to organize a visit for his firefighters so that they can see the panorama together. And he was telling me how they've put out fires and, you know, all over the city, basically. But Andre came in a I mean, he's really quite a dandy here in his outfit, but he came with his entire family to the opening. And Gia, it's super interesting to see her history of how she became a community leader. Marisa and Veronica have been, if we go back to the painting of Marisa and Veronica, they've really been active participants. This is the latest one of my work for such a long time, you know, since Veronica is a community leader herself. She runs a group of women that's called Mujeres en Movimiento that build their own bicycles. And and, use that as a way, obviously, of having freedom of transport throughout the city. And Marisa might one day be a lawyer and activist herself. And the first paintings I gave, they owned. And I've seen, it's been really, when I was in the Whitney Biennial, Veronica led a group of youth through the museum, through my exhibition, about the work that she does as well. So each composition, each group I work with leads, there has to be kind of sensitive outreach and investigation beforehand on my end, so that it's not intrusive, and so that it can be fruitful for both parties.
So I wanted to thank you. I mean, all of the stories are really so fascinating, and it feels really nice to have room to to have room to include those as a function of the paintings that you're making. And I also wanted to something that I was thinking about as I was looking at all of your work and thinking about it and reading about it was this subtext about tiles in the work that sort of became like one of the imminent subjects that I encountered as I was looking at the work. So from the school floor tiles that we talked about a little bit, and how tiling can create an environment, right? In that case, a kind of both protective covering and a reference to a different kind of institutional setting. To your repeated usage of different tiles in your work, particularly talavera, but also papel picado in this, in the image that you just had up, kind of performs a similar function. So that's another way that tile becomes present in the work. And then I think also in the way that you've talked about the attention to skin and like color tiling together parts of the face is another kind of subtextual tiling in your work, as well as this kind of clustering or arranging of items. And I was thinking about tiles because, first of all, they're modular, right? So you can build them out, you can use them to decorate. They have this function, which is simultaneously decorative and protective. But they also, historically carry these other legacies and this other historical weight, where talavera is specifically interesting, of course, because it represents this like colonial history of like Spanish mayolica glazing being imposed on top of the indigenous clay from Puebla in order to create object that would have local significance and would also be exported and be treated as a kind of like colonial, what do we call it? I mean, just an object, but a souvenir almost, right? It's like in terms of how it was then exported internationally. And I was thinking about the kind of like this sort of symbolic or significatory logic in your work around the various histories that you're bringing to the table, and also the function of craft to carry forward this historical legacy inside of the work. And I was wondering, how you're thinking about this and your interest in different kind of craft and its inclusion in your work.
You're a woman after all my own heart with those thoughts, because I feel, yes, that it's so rich, isn't it? Like those crafts, and when you live in Mexico, that kind of layering of history is just like everywhere, and I feel that I started with this painting, for example. On the right, I was really careful with the tiles, and then towards the left, I was like going abstractly because they were too elaborate to actually depict all the details. But I at one point I was really interested in thinking of the kind of embroidery and kind of retranscribing that embroidery also in my painting, like these facets or fractals in some ways of little moments of tiles. And nobody has ever described the face as kind of tile-like, but it is, right? There's obviously an interest in my work of Cezanne and like these history of kind of passage painting where one color is kind of contingent on what's next to it. But I a little bit unconsciously, a little bit consciously, I was thinking of tiles and textiles as a way to kind of envelop and fill space, you know, kind of envelop the sitters and kind of have all these. I was really interested in Bonnard as well and how he does like kind of optical, you know, like movement with your eye with different textile combinations. But you know, the border between Mexico and the US is one of the most transited in the world. And likewise, the colonial history between Spain and Portugal and Mexico, with all the material culture that kind of led to this mestizo or kind of hybrid culture that is the Mexican identity right now, and how to depict how, you know, our sense of identity and everything is so intersectional and so nuanced with these historical layers. So trying to kind of show these histories and as much kind of complexity as I can, because I think sometimes identity gets reduced to very kind of itemized, you know, very kind of isolated things when it can be pretty complex.
I was also, I mean, this is sort of like a personal pet peeve and interest, which is like how there have been times when I've just sort of thought about how much easier it would be to visualize the legacy of colonialism if we talked about it in relationship to like every Sudbaran still life that included that included a pot that was obviously from like Guadalajara or Peru. And the ways that these objects lose the material history, specifically like in European contexts, but then are like overvaluated when they come from non-Western contexts. So being able to think about like the function of tiling, talavera, especially the way that like a tile allows for an image which is specific to itself, which can also become part of a pattern, as opposed to thinking about image as having this like one dominant viewpoint, and relating that to like Bonnard and the kind of luminosity and like sparkling quality that he brings to a domestic interior feels like such a rich conversation, which also I think can also bring us to the place about domestic interiors and maybe why for you thinking about this domestic space is so important.
Yeah, that's so, it's so true that like that a textile or a barro, you know, of what's it called, material, a clay from Oaxaca or from Puebla gets layered into all these different contexts. And I was just thinking when we started talking about tile, how in my kitchen when I was growing up there was all these tiles that later got demolished. So maybe that's part of the reason why the tiles enter some of the paintings. But I that's an aside. What was this? What? Okay, domestic. Like I think that the domestic sphere is one that we would hope is somewhat autonomous from the way like the larger politics and tries to infringe on a person's life. At least the domestic sphere can be private, but obviously, as we're seeing with all the situation, all the debates about abortion right now, obviously the domestic sphere is not private either, you know. So, but initially I was interested in the domestic sphere as this kind of space of autonomy, not only like the people as kind of engage in their own thoughts, their own private world that's not about engaging stereotypes or ways that people might perceive them, but also the domestic sphere and that kind of space that has this some kind of sense of autonomy in terms of cooking and all these ways that people show joy in communal space oftentimes, and especially in Latin American culture.
So that kind of brings me to, I think, probably one of the last questions that I have, and I know we have still a little bit of time, but I'm sure there are also going to be a lot of questions. But I wanted to open up also the what the title of the show, right, which is Queen's Lindo y Querido. I sort of badly translated as beautiful and beloved, which could also be like beautiful and cared for. And so I was wondering, I know we've sort of talked about a lot of these things or around them, but I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about Lindo y Querido as the subtext of the show, literally, and yeah, what that means for you.
Oh, that's a great place to end. That title really came. I was thinking of this famous. Anyone that knows mariachi music knows Mexico Lindo y Querido, and it's Vicente Fernandez used it. So many different historical Mexican musicians use that song, but it's like the epitome of like longing for Mexico. He's the song basically goes like, if I die, I love you, Mexico lindo querido. If I die far away from you, tell them that I'm dead and bring them, so you bring my body back to Mexico. And so it's a kind of longing to come back. And obviously, Queens is the borough of one of the most diverse boroughs in the world, and made of so many people that have come from elsewhere, and they find their home here. And at the same time, you know, when you are kind of two different cultures, there's always like a little bit of wanting to go back, or there's a commonality with all migrants, I think, of kind of being half here, half there, you know, and I found it quite a bit in my conversations with lots of the people in Queens. So I thought that song would be very appropriate, and the beloved is, yeah, just trying to bring that sense of kind of the communities that are formed, and my respect for them and my desire to honor them.
And I know it was like last question, but I then had another sort of question. Funny, this is how it always is with me. But another thing that I noticed, just sort of looking at the images, was how often newspapers are a part of your work. And it's really interesting to think about the newspaper as like the way out of the kind of domestic enclosure that you were talking about earlier, right? That like as folks are in their space and surrounded by their things that they feel comfortable with, there's also, you know, like the New York Times features in a number of your paintings. And of course, like the past couple of years have been marked by this perpetual like enclosure being like punctured by the news, as if by stabbing, right? Like all of the bad news we encounter all of the time. And so I just wanted to ask a question both about newspapers and also about these other kind of the pictures that often are included in the work, all of these represented objects inside of these domestic spaces that like point back into the world.
Yeah, it was a little unconscious, the newspaper reference that came into quite a few of them, but it was marked by particular moments, days that I actually visited people in their home, and newsworthy things were happening. And for example, here there's a score sheet of like I don't know what song it was, but it's basically the Mexican kind of the eagle devouring a snake over a nopal, you know, that's classic of Mexico. And there's a Frida Kahlo image that I found in their home. So just thinking about the material culture that forms a person's being, but always points to outside. So I think that's a great way to put it, that we're always kind of, even in these, and I think about painting very much like that, like even though you're in your space making private, you know, work in your like solo studio, it's such a social activity, you know, and you're in conversation with other painters that form your social sphere, but also with historical painters, and in this case with particular individuals. So I'm really interested in that relationship with it being such a social activity as well.
Yeah,
So should we open it to questions now, or?
I think, right? I
Yeah.
know it's not exactly two, but I feel like we got a lot in there. So I'm sure folks have other questions as well.
Aliza and Gabby, this has been so lovely. Thank you so much for this generous conversation. We do have many wonderful questions today, so I'll give folks a chance to ask you their questions, starting with Craig. Hi, Craig. I'm going to give you the chance to unmute.
Hi, Aliza.
Hi, Craig.
My question is about painting, the act of painting, and you were just kind of getting into it a little bit there in the last question from Gabby. And I visited your studio, I think in 2015, back when this project was all getting going, and I'm thrilled to see how it's evolved. And obviously the broader community aspect, the sociological aspect, is the sort of phenomenal development in the project that has taken place. But I'm interested in how, thinking about the act of painting, thinking about what happens, you were talking about that solitary moment in the studio when you're actually called on to put on paint, and the community that you're talking to in your head as that is going on, because we all do that. But just how you're thinking about painting has changed, how your experience of painting. Certainly the surfaces have changed over time. I'd say, generally speaking, from a more painterly beginning to a more finished surface now, I think, in simple terms. But, and just think the act of painting as an act of thinking, how that affects you. So
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I feel like this is, as painters, I feel like that is, so endless. It's a project that obviously will take our lifetime, but it's a vocabulary that almost, people that know how to look at painting and are painters, it's almost like an alchemical vocabulary that we have of our own, right? And I think that I always think about color very much as something that guides me, putting sometimes like for the Delta piece, I purposefully went a little bit tighter than I would because it was going to get translated into mosaics. So it was hard to translate. I saw many examples of the company that, it's hard to translate a big gestural form into mosaic, although it can be done, like for what I do with hair and stuff. So each painting, has its own kind of logic, where the one of the class has this very abstract kind of gestural background to mimic the night changing, the setting sun or something, which is when my class would take place, like from 5 to 8. And then like starting with maybe some factual things, some like mimicking their drawings, and then inventing and changing all the colors of the clothes and giving things a texture, scraping into paint to make it like scratchy, which is something that is hard it doesn't translate very much in the photographs, but I feel like I'm really interested in the tactile quality of paint and color. That's obviously something that's really guiding me, almost more than narrative is this kind of the sense of color and making sometimes odd or surprise things that surprise me in terms of color choices.
thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing question, Craig. And thanks for that answer, Aliza. The next question is going to be from GE. GE, hi, it's good to see you today, and I'm going to give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you, Chloe. Great to see everyone here and great to be here. Thank you, Aliza. Thank you, Gabby. And by the way, I loved Craig's question. That really got to a lot of neat stuff. My question is, do you believe, this is a very general question, but I think it kind of then zeroes into what you're doing or dials into. Do you believe art comes from culture and vice versa? And that it really then serves to wake us up to what we've been glossing over all these years and all this time, but then to really allow the tang of sense to lift us into necessary thought.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love, even Marx would say that the history of the world is the history of the five senses, you know, so like, I feel like there's so much, the history is embedded in sense understanding, you know, and it goes back to Craig's question as well. Like, I think culture comes from our biography, like our sense of color or our choices come literally from the way we were brought up, our sensual or material interests are really our biography pretty much, and that kind of lets us into a knowledge that's not as literal, but it might be ahead of its time, or many different times existing simultaneously, because it's about material and kind of the senses, which are much more intelligent than we give them credit for.
Thank you so very much.
Thanks, G. That was an amazing question too. Thank you. And thank you, Aliza, for that answer. The next question is going to be from Winnie. Winnie, I will give you the chance to unmute.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I really love your work, Aliza, and I'm so happy I got to be here and listen to your talk. I often wonder about like this idea of the responsibility to represent truth about the person or the sitter, because it's kind of like a very old, like, and also elusive question in history of art about how to represent a truth or essence of a sitter. And I'm thinking about like early medieval work by like the Veil of Veronica, for example, as a picture of truth. And so when you're painting your subject, how do you get there, or how do you collaborate with your subject, and as you speak to them, does your paint change? Does your painting change, and the way you present them change? And do you feel like kind of like there's a transference of experience from your sitter to yourself? And I mean, all this abstract ideas that comes up through your process. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, I think that's a great question. I mean, the Veil of Veronica, that anything that's kind of like an imprint, well, that's, you know, that is not an interpretation. That's just like a direct. I feel like painting can never be that truthful. It's always a confluence of my own, and that's why it's interesting, or kind of like dialogical in some ways, because it's them and their experience and my perception of them, and trying to be sensitive, but you can never know another person's like interiority or something so fully, so you try to approximate it. And then there's also the experience of the viewer and their interpretation, which might be completely different than both the subject and then the author. And so, you know, it's a really interesting question. It's not photography, but also now we know that photography is also not so truthful. So I think it's this, I'm really interested much more in this kind of hybrid of the three viewers or three interpreters that are making a work of art, you know, and what kind of, like, it's kind of almost a melding of the maker, the subject, and the viewer. And that's more interesting to me than kind of ultimate truth in some ways. I mean, or it's what I do. I'm sure there's a lot of space for ultimate real truth. I'm also interested in that, but it's not necessarily what I do.
Thank you. Thank you. I just remember because one of my professor in art school used to say, like, you are actually offering a fiction, is a type of fiction. But I also think about this type of literature that's more autobiographical fiction, or something that's very much like based on like history or truth or storytelling or narrative of that person. But then you also added like some kind of like interpretation to it, which is like very fascinating to me. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that amazing question, Winnie. And thank you for that response, Aliza. The last questions today are going to be from me. So my first question, Aliza, is Tacita Dean was on the NSE last week and was talking about how when she pitches a video portrait to her sitters, she pitches it as a painting. And it's really interesting relative to your work and how you've painted individuals over very long periods of time and sat with them time and time again. And I'm curious what that process is like for you and how you know you want to paint someone again. Like, are there moments that spur another painting, or is it you and your own process and when you think it's time? I'm curious how you decide.
That's a great question. It's sometimes, yes, it's like being the deeper you go, the more paintings sometimes can come up, or the opposite can happen where I just can't paint somebody anymore because we've become too close or something. So it's like then I like with Veronica and Marisa, I was so into this like colorful quilt that they had. It's just like or they make dinner for me, and then I really want to paint this the papel picado that they have. So it's just like, if you still have curiosity or I don't know, there has to be some chemistry of it, when there is still that chemistry or that curiosity for trying to get at something elusive, but it can function the other way around, where it becomes almost prohibitive when you become too close to somebody.
Yeah, and my second question is, I really like the way your work bridges the gap between, well, not the gap between, but really bridges pedagogy with practice. And often in institutions, there's sort of a deliberate separation of education departments and curatorial. And so have you found your work has interesting impacts in the context of institutions as you work with them over time?
Yeah, that's sometimes the sitters can sometimes be the first witnesses of the work, but sometimes my work might open up a space for people that might not have had it might be their first introduction into the art world. So it's nice to be able to kind of bridge a gap between work that might function on the institutional level and be there and within the art world, and as well bridge the gap between people like in some of the communities in the Queens Museum that is their first introduction into the art. And
amazing. Thank you so much for those answers. And thank you everyone today for your amazing questions. This has been just such a lovely event, and it's not over yet. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Stephanie Adams-Santos to the virtual stage. Multidisciplinary writer and artist, Stephanie Adams-Santos's work is rooted in the crossroads of ritual, ancestry, and environment, with a penchant for the weird, the queer, and surreal. She's the author of several collections of poetry, including Dream of Shibaba, winner of the Orison Books Poetry Prize, Swarm Queen's Crown, and The Sundering. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie.
Thank you so much. I feel so honored to be at the end of this conversation. There's so many beautiful things said that I feel very connected to. And I especially love, Aliza, what you said about the history of the world being a history of the five senses. And I totally believe that and live in that reality. And it's a great transition, actually, because this book that I'm going to read from, Dream of Xibalba, it's officially out today. And it's a very long poem told in fragments, and it's very much about how the body is a place of history and lineage and memory, and how those things live in flesh and bone and in the world around us too, in objects. So I'm just gonna read, pick a section near the end. This is a fun edition. This is the one mistake copy that's backwards. So I love reading from this one. So it's actually the end of the book, but it looks like it's at the beginning. Most days you move like a ship, blood over the desert. The rolls of your back slope like the dunes themselves. When you lie down, the softness startles you, your nakedness conversing with the elements. A sadness fans out into carnal shapes, the crystal habit of the rose. The specter rides in you, a long white ribbon suckled to your mist. You know you ought to tear it out and kill it once and for all. You ought to crawl again toward the bed, make your way back to the one who loves you, to her sturdy hands and her strong, tattooed arms that hold the pillows down as if you were there. But the shape in the living room unfolds like a screen. You are lit with emptiness, and you stay with it, nowhere, hooked to where you stand. A spiral peels open in you without dimension. You stay with it until morning comes to spit you out. You hoof your way up the temple stairs in a cloak of burrs. Light slashes its own stem, throws a bouquet of vicious color across the sky. The moon is looking. Go slow now, don't run, or it'll chase you. Day and night you carve a circle from stone, comiendo la casa de barro, on the hill where no one can see you, gnawing and grinding, taking unto yourself the adobe that tastes of flesh, the splendor of dirt. You consume the old house, flesh without sorrow. Your swollen head suckles the stars, filled with the glinting blue fire of the dead. In the kitchen, Masa lifts on the fire, little faces of the moon shaped by someone else's hands. A burning angel feeds at the shadows there, a smell of white lilies from the corner of the room. Fuego de matapalos, fuego verde, red light of birth, blank light of death. You wrench yourself ajar to the first blow, the first memory, a primal contusion. You read by touch, sigils grumbling in the living cavern where past lives grow ensconced in flesh. Your eyes are sealed, muted, the obsidian veils of a mirror hewn from stone. Upon your fingers, a text blackens, cutting as you open to the book of flowers, flores milagrosas que brotan en sangre. The sierra whispers into your feet a voice of crushed stone. Step forward, half in sleep, into the capilla of the midnight eye. One day you'll return to the place of the parrots. Unhunt them, give back the depths of their eyes. A toad sings from your tongue, vanishing into water. Green and brown, then black, swimming into the shadows. From the sole of each foot, 2 stela grow upright, bearing the names you've forgotten, the names you never knew. Only an insect persists in the yard, unseen for the dark, its black churr waves invisibly between us, a veil of anguish enfolding our kiss. Step forward into darkness again, where demons' paper wings wave bright kites from the altars of the void. The sun's orphaned roots recite the throbbing vowels of a nest into your hands, trace a clutch of eggs golden beneath your tongue. A blue flame in the hearth of all your memories, untouchable germ of remembrance. 1 foot pierces the world below, and the other firm above. May the green sword of the angel guide your feet and know the holy sting of its touch. When the locust comes to the window, you must let your blood move to each side, making a path. It's okay if you have nothing to sing. Sensation walks through you. It's okay to lie still, to let the blooming happen all around you. You will be good again when the flimsy grass pierces the earth. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, that was amazing. Thank you so much for reading today. That was wonderful. Such an extension and expansion to today's dialogue. And thank you again to Aliza and to Gaby. And thank you as well to Paige at Anton Kern Gallery for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our free and growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow, I hope you'll join us at 1 p.m. for a Rail reading with poet Simone White. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Beautiful.
So much. And go see the
Thank you for the
show in
reading.
Queens. Go see the show at the
Thank you.
Go see the show. Thank you so
this
much.
summer.
Thank you.